The notification sound chimed again, cutting through the peaceful morning air of my studio apartment in downtown Phoenix. My Samsung phone vibrated against the glass coffee table, the screen illuminating with familiar contacts that used to bring comfort, but now only brought dread. Sarah, Michael, Mom. The same trio that had been trying to reach me for the past 4 months since I'd walked away from the Spanish-style house in Scottsdale. But before I tell you the complete story of how I broke free from a family that saw me as their personal ATM rather than their daughter, I'd love to know, where are you experiencing this story from? Whether you're listening during your morning commute, taking a break at work, or winding down for the evening, your support means everything. If stories about setting boundaries and finding your worth resonate with you, please like this content and subscribe for daily tales of courage, family dynamics, and personal transformation. 4 months ago, I had quietly packed my belongings into 2 suitcases and left the only home I'd known for 28 years. There had been no dramatic confrontation, no slammed doors or tearful goodbyes. Just the soft click of the front door closing behind me after my mother's final words still echoed in the foyer. If you think you're too good for this family, then don't let the door hit you on your way out. I had simply turned around, picked up my bags, and walked toward my Honda Civic without looking back. Now I sat in my small but peaceful apartment in the Arts District, surrounded by walls I had painted myself in calming sage green. Every piece of furniture had been carefully chosen by me, for me, from the second-hand armchair I'd reupholstered to the small, succulent garden thriving on my windowsill. For the first time in my adult life, no one was waiting to hand me a stack of bills or remind me of my family obligations. The phone buzzed again. This time, it was my younger brother Michael, 26 years old and still living in his childhood bedroom. The preview of his text made my stomach clench. "Lara, Mom says you're being selfish. Dad's medication costs went up and..." I swiped the notification away without reading the rest. I'd heard variations of this message countless times over the past 6 years. Ever since I'd graduated from Arizona State with my accounting degree and landed my first real job at a mid-sized firm in Tempe, I had somehow become the family's unofficial financial safety net. What started as just helping out during a rough patch had gradually evolved into an expectation that my paycheck belonged to everyone but me. Michael, the baby of the family, who had been coddled and protected from every consequence since birth, had never held a job for longer than 3 months. Yet somehow, he always had money for the latest PlayStation games, expensive sneakers, and weekend trips to Sedona with his friends. That money came from somewhere, and that somewhere had been my bank account for far too long. I used to work 55 hours a week at Henderson & Associates, then drive straight to my parents' house to grocery shop, clean, and handle whatever crisis had emerged that day. I had been the reliable one, the responsible daughter who kept the family ship from sinking while everyone else seemed content to poke holes in the hull. I had genuinely believed that if I just worked harder, gave more, proved my love through sacrifice, they would eventually see me as more than just a solution to their problems. I was wrong. Picking up my coffee mug, a simple white ceramic piece I'd bought myself as a small celebration when I signed the lease on this place, I walked to my small balcony. The Arizona morning was crisp, with that particular quality of light that made the desert landscape look almost ethereal. Below, I could see people walking their dogs, grabbing coffee from the cafe on the corner, living their lives without the constant weight of other people's expectations pressing down on their shoulders. The phone lit up once more. Mom, calling for the 4th time this morning. I watched her name flash on the screen, remembering all the times I had dropped everything to answer her calls, all the times I had canceled plans with friends, skipped lunch breaks, and worked through weekends, because family comes first. All the times I had believed that being needed was the same thing as being loved. I let it go to voicemail. Setting the phone face down on my small patio table, I allowed myself to feel the quiet. Not the tense, anticipatory quiet of waiting for the next demand or crisis, but the genuine peace of a Sunday morning that belonged entirely to me. The distant sound of traffic mixed with birdsong, and for a moment, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: the absence of anxiety. The day I left had been surprisingly ordinary. No storm clouds gathering dramatically overhead, no sense of impending doom. I had simply reached my breaking point during what should have been a family dinner. I had brought groceries, cooked for everyone, and cleaned up afterward, just like always. But when Michael casually mentioned that he needed $800 for a business opportunity, and Mom immediately turned to me with that expectant look I knew so well, something inside me finally snapped. Not with anger, but with clarity. I had looked around that dining room table, at my father, reading his newspaper as if the conversation didn't concern him, at Michael scrolling through his phone while making financial demands, at my mother, who had perfected the art of emotional manipulation disguised as motherly concern, and I had finally seen the truth. I wasn't their daughter in these moments. I was their employee, their insurance policy, their get-out-of-jail-free card, and I was tired of being invisible, except when they needed something. The voicemail notification popped up. I considered listening to it, then decided against it. Whatever crisis they thought I needed to solve could wait. Or better yet, they could solve it themselves for once. I had spent the last 4 months learning to distinguish between genuine emergencies and manufactured drama, designed to pull me back into their web of dysfunction. As I sat in my peaceful corner of Phoenix, watching the morning light stretch across the mountains in the distance, I realized that the silence I had once feared had become my greatest teacher. It had shown me the difference between being alone and being lonely, between family and obligation, between love and exploitation. The phone stayed quiet for the rest of the morning, and I smiled. I remember the exact moment when everything started to shift in our family dynamic. It was 3 years ago, on a sweltering July afternoon in Scottsdale. I had just received my first promotion at Henderson & Associates, a bump from junior accountant to senior associate that came with a modest but meaningful salary increase. I was 25, proud of myself for the first time in years, and eager to share the good news with the people I thought would celebrate my success. The house was unusually quiet when I arrived, my professional heels clicking against the terracotta tiles my mother had insisted on during their last renovation. The air conditioning hummed steadily, fighting against the 115-degree heat that made Arizona summers feel like living inside an oven. I found them gathered in the living room, Dad in his recliner with the evening news turned down low, Mom folding laundry on the sectional sofa, and Michael sprawled across the carpet with his laptop, supposedly job hunting but more likely watching gaming videos. "I have news," I announced, unable to contain my excitement completely. I had worked 60-hour weeks for 8 months straight to earn this promotion, staying late to double-check every client file, volunteering for the most challenging cases, proving myself in a field where attention to detail could make or break careers. Dad glanced up from his newspaper, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. "Oh, what's that, sweetheart?" "I got promoted to senior associate. It comes with a 20% raise." I waited for smiles, congratulations, maybe even a suggestion to celebrate. Instead, the room fell into an odd stillness. Mom set down the shirt she'd been folding and turned to face me fully. "That's wonderful, honey. Really wonderful." But her tone carried something else, something calculating that I didn't recognize at the time. "You know, your father and I have been talking about finances lately. With your success and all." I should have seen it coming. Should have noticed how quickly the conversation pivoted from my achievement to their needs. But I was still basking in the glow of professional recognition, still believing that good things happen to people who worked hard, and that family meant sharing both struggles and victories. "The property taxes went up again this year," Dad chimed in, folding his newspaper with a crisp snap. "Nearly $1,800 more than last year. It's getting harder for people on fixed incomes like us to keep up." Mom nodded sympathetically, as if she and Dad were the victims of some cosmic injustice, rather than homeowners who had refinanced their house 3 times to fund various investments that never materialized. "We hate to ask, but with your new position and all, maybe you could help us out just this once? Just until we get back on our feet." Michael looked up from his laptop for the first time since I'd arrived. "Yeah, Lara's doing well for herself now, she can afford it." He said it with such casual entitlement, as if my success automatically belonged to the whole family. I felt something cold settle in my stomach, but I pushed it away. These were my parents, my brother. They had fed me, housed me, sent me to college. Helping them during a difficult time wasn't unreasonable. It was what families did for each other. Of course, I heard myself saying. How much do you need? That was my first mistake, asking how much instead of asking why they couldn't manage their own finances. That was the moment I unknowingly signed up to become the family's personal bailout fund. Just the $1,800 for now, Mom said quickly. We'll pay you back once Dad's retirement check comes in next month. You know we're good for it. I transferred the money that evening, sitting at my own kitchen table in the small apartment I rented near the university. It felt good to help, like I was finally contributing something meaningful to the family that had given me so much. I even felt a little proud that I was in a position to solve their problem so easily. But Dad's retirement check that month went toward a new riding lawnmower. And the month after that, there was another emergency. The water heater had given out, a real crisis this time, not something that could wait. Mom called me at work, her voice stressed and apologetic. I'm so sorry to bother you during the day, but we got a quote from 3 different companies. The cheapest one is still $1,200, and we just don't have it right now. Michael's been looking for work, but you know how tough the job market is. I glanced around the office, at my colleagues handling their own client calls and deadlines, and felt a familiar tug of obligation mixed with something I couldn't quite name. Something that felt like resentment, but that I immediately pushed down, because good daughters don't resent helping their families. I can cover it, I said quietly, already pulling up my banking app. But this time, can we set up a payment plan? I'm trying to save for a down payment on my own place. Of course, sweetheart. Absolutely. We'll work out something fair. That payment plan never materialized. Instead, 3 weeks later, it was Michael's car. Then Dad's prescription medications that insurance wouldn't cover. Then the air conditioning unit that chose August to break down. Each time, the request came with apologies and promises of repayment. Each time, I said yes because I had been raised to believe that love meant sacrifice, that being needed was the same as being valued. What I didn't realize was that I was training them to see me as a solution, rather than a person. The requests started coming more frequently. Mom would call during my lunch breaks, her voice tight with worry about some household crisis that required immediate financial intervention. Dad would send carefully worded texts about temporary setbacks that somehow always coincided with my payday. And Michael never asked directly. He would simply mention his problems within earshot, knowing that Mom would relay the information to me with her own editorial commentary about how much he was struggling and how a little help could make all the difference. I started working overtime not just for professional advancement, but because I needed the extra money to keep up with their escalating needs. My own apartment remained sparsely furnished because every extra dollar went toward maintaining their standard of living. My social life dwindled to nothing because I was either working late or driving to Scottsdale to handle some crisis that required my immediate attention and financial contribution. The breaking point should have come when I realized I had spent my entire emergency fund on their emergencies, or when I had to choose between buying myself winter clothes and covering Michael's car insurance, or when I worked through the flu because I couldn't afford to take time off, not because my job wouldn't pay me, but because my family's monthly expenses had somehow become my responsibility. But the breaking point didn't come then. It came on an ordinary Wednesday evening when I was sitting in their living room, watching Michael play video games on the expensive gaming setup I had unknowingly funded, while Mom planned a weekend trip to Flagstaff that I definitely couldn't afford but would undoubtedly be expected to subsidize. That's when I finally understood that I had become invisible, except when they needed something. I was the family ATM, dispensing support and solutions on demand, but never receiving the basic courtesy of being asked about my own needs, dreams, or limitations. The realization didn't come with anger or tears. It came with a quiet, devastating clarity that would change everything. The favoritism in our house didn't announce itself with fanfare. It seeped in quietly, like water damage behind walls, invisible until the structure started to rot from within. Growing up, I thought every family operated the way ours did, with one child who could do no wrong and another who could never do enough right. Michael had always been the sun around which our family's solar system revolved. Born 3 years after me, he arrived with a complicated delivery that required an emergency C-section and a week-long NICU stay. Mom never let anyone forget those first precarious days, as if his dramatic entrance into the world had earned him a lifetime pass from accountability. "He's special," she would say whenever teachers called about missed assignments or when neighbors complained about his bike blocking their driveway. "He just needs extra understanding." I learned early that Michael's needs always came first, but I thought that was normal. Older siblings were supposed to be responsible, weren't they? I was supposed to set the example, be the steady one, make room for his more delicate constitution. At least, that's what Mom always told me when I complained about the obvious double standard that governed our household. When I was 12 and Michael was 9, I watched him accidentally break Dad's prized golf trophy while throwing a tennis ball in the living room. The award was from Dad's company tournament in 1995, a cheap metal figure mounted on fake marble, but Dad displayed it prominently on the mantelpiece like it was the Masters Tournament green jacket. The crash echoed through the house, followed by the distinct sound of metal hitting tile. Mom rushed in from the kitchen, her eyes immediately scanning the room for the source of the noise. Michael stood frozen beside the broken pieces, tennis ball still in his hand, guilt written across his face in bold letters. But when Mom's gaze landed on me, sitting quietly in the corner with my homework spread across the coffee table, her expression shifted. "Lara," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone of disappointment I knew so well. "Did you break Dad's trophy?" I stared at her, confused. "No, I was doing my math homework. Michael was." "I saw you playing with that ball earlier," she continued, as if I hadn't spoken. "You know better than to throw things in the living room." Michael said nothing. He didn't correct her assumption or admit his mistake. He simply stood there, watching me take the blame for something he had done, and I could see in his eyes that this was how he expected things to work. I was the responsible one, the one who should have been watching him, the one who should have prevented the accident even if I hadn't caused it. "I didn't break it," I said again, but my voice was smaller now, uncertain. Dad walked in just as the words left my mouth. He surveyed the damage, his face cycling through disappointment and resignation. "Lara, we've talked about this before. You need to be more careful." "But Dad, I didn't." "That's enough," Mom interrupted. "Clean this up and think about what you've done. And you're grounded from TV for the rest of the week." I spent that evening in my room, staring at the ceiling and trying to understand what had just happened. It wasn't the first time Michael had escaped consequences while I shouldered the blame, but it was the first time I recognized the pattern clearly. The golden child could do no wrong, while the responsible child was responsible for everything, including things she didn't do. This dynamic followed us through adolescence and into adulthood, becoming more pronounced as the stakes grew higher. When Michael got his first job at 17, a part-time position at a local sporting goods store, the family celebrated like he had just been appointed CEO of a Fortune 500 company. Mom posted pictures on Facebook, Dad took him out for a congratulatory dinner, and even distant relatives called to express their pride. When I graduated summa cum laude from Arizona State with my accounting degree, the response was notably more subdued. "Well, we always knew you were smart," Dad said, barely looking up from his evening crossword puzzle. "Just make sure you find something stable." Mom's reaction was even more telling. "It's about time all that studying paid off. Now maybe you can start contributing more around here." Michael lasted exactly 6 weeks at the sporting goods store before quitting because, according to him, the manager didn't understand his work style. Instead of disappointment or lectures about responsibility, he received sympathy and assurance that he would find something better suited to his talents. Meanwhile, I had been working since I was 16, first at a local ice cream shop, then as a tutor for younger students, then through college at various part-time jobs to help offset my expenses. The contrast became most obvious during family gatherings. At Christmas dinners or birthday celebrations, the conversation inevitably centered around Michael's latest interest or struggle. His brief stint in community college art classes was discussed with the enthusiasm usually reserved for Pulitzer Prize announcements. His decision to switch majors 3 times was framed as exploring his creativity rather than academic instability. When I mentioned my own achievements, landing a competitive internship, receiving recognition for a complex audit I had completed, or even something as simple as being commended by a client, the response was polite but perfunctory. "That's nice, dear," followed by an immediate redirect to whatever Michael was dealing with that week. I began to understand that in our family's narrative, I was the supporting character whose job was to make the protagonist look good. My successes were expected, my struggles were minimized, and my needs were invisible unless they interfered with Michael's comfort or my parents' peace of mind. The most painful example happened during my college graduation ceremony. I had worked 3 jobs throughout my senior year to avoid taking out additional student loans, maintaining a 3.8 GPA, while paying for my own textbooks, meal plans, and even parking passes. The ceremony was scheduled for a Saturday morning in May, and I had specifically asked my family to attend weeks in advance. That same weekend, Michael decided he wanted to attend a music festival in Tucson with his friends. It wasn't a special occasion, just a spontaneous decision that conflicted with my graduation. When I mentioned the scheduling conflict, Mom sighed as if I had presented her with an impossible puzzle. "Michael's been looking forward to this for weeks," she said, despite the fact that he had literally announced his plans the night before. "And you know he doesn't get many opportunities to socialize. Can't you understand the ceremony isn't really that important? You're graduating either way." Dad nodded in agreement. "We're proud of you regardless, sweetheart. You don't need us there to make it official." They didn't attend my graduation. I walked across that stage, accepted my diploma, and took my ceremonial photos alone, while my parents drove Michael to his festival and helped him set up his camping gear. When I called them that evening to tell them about the ceremony, Mom's first question was whether Michael had texted me about needing gas money for the drive home. That night, sitting in my apartment with my diploma propped against a lamp on my kitchen table, I finally began to see the truth I had been avoiding for years. Love in our family wasn't distributed equally. It was rationed, with Michael receiving the lion's share, while I received just enough to keep me functional and compliant. I had been raised to believe that earning love meant being useful, being low maintenance, being the one who solved problems rather than created them. But Michael had been raised to believe that love was his birthright, that his comfort and happiness were the family's primary concern, and that other people, specifically me, existed to ensure his needs were met. The pattern was so deeply entrenched that questioning it felt like betraying everything I had been taught about loyalty and family bonds. But as I stared at my diploma that night, I began to wonder what might happen if I stopped being quite so useful, quite so reliable, quite so willing to disappear into the background of my own life. That wondering would eventually grow into something much more dangerous to the family system that had shaped us both. The radical idea that I deserved to be seen, heard, and valued for who I was rather than what I could provide. But that realization was still years away. For now, I was still the good daughter, still believing that if I just tried a little harder, gave a little more, proved myself a little better, they would finally see me as clearly as they saw Michael. I was still living in the delusion that their love was something I could earn, rather than something I had always deserved. The emergency that finally opened my eyes came on a Tuesday evening in March, during what should have been the busiest season of my career. Tax season at Henderson & Associates meant 14-hour days, weekend work, and enough caffeine to power a small city. I had been surviving on protein bars and sheer determination for 3 weeks straight, handling complex corporate returns that required every ounce of my attention and expertise. I was at my desk at 9:30 p.m., squinting at spreadsheets that seemed to blur together after hours of analysis, when my phone rang. Mom's contact photo, a smiling picture from last Christmas, filled the screen. I almost let it go to voicemail, but family calls during work hours usually meant genuine emergencies. "Lara, honey, I'm so sorry to bother you." Mom's voice carried that familiar mixture of urgency and guilt that I had learned to recognize as the prelude to a request. "But we have a situation here, and I don't know who else to call." I rubbed my tired eyes, already feeling my shoulders tense. "What's wrong?" Michael's car broke down on the freeway near Tempe. The engine just died, and now it's stuck in rush hour traffic. The tow truck quote is $350, and the mechanic says it might need a whole new transmission. We're talking about $4,000 minimum. My stomach dropped. $4,000. I had that much in my savings account, money I had been carefully setting aside for the down payment on a house. Money that represented years of working overtime and skipping small luxuries so I could build towards something of my own. Can't he call AAA? Or what about Dad's insurance roadside assistance? We tried everything, Mom continued, her voice growing more strained. AAA expired last month, and Dad's policy doesn't cover Michael since he's over 25. The car is blocking traffic, and the police are getting involved. He's panicking, Lara. You know how he gets in stressful situations. I did know. Michael had never developed healthy coping mechanisms for stress, because someone had always appeared to solve his problems before he had to face them. Usually, that someone was me. Where are you and Dad? Can't you help him? Your father's back is acting up again, and I can't drive in heavy traffic anymore. You know my night vision isn't what it used to be. Michael called us first, but we're just not equipped to handle this kind of emergency. I stared at my computer screen, at the client files that needed to be completed before morning, at the work that actually paid my bills and built my career. Then I looked at my phone, at the invisible weight of expectation pressing down through the speaker. I'm in the middle of a crucial deadline, I said carefully. I have 3 client presentations tomorrow morning that I haven't finished preparing for. Can this wait until… Lara, Mom interrupted, her tone shifting to something sharper. Your brother is stranded on the side of a highway. This is an emergency. Surely your job can understand family comes first. There it was. Family comes first. The phrase that had been used to justify every inconvenience, every sacrifice, every time my needs were deemed less important than everyone else's comfort. I had heard it so many times that it had become background music to my life, a constant reminder of where I stood in the hierarchy of family priorities. Okay, I said, already shutting down my computer. I'll transfer the money for the tow truck and deal with the car repair estimate tomorrow. You're an angel, Mom said, relief flooding her voice. I don't know what we'd do without you. But as I gathered my things and prepared to leave the office, something felt different this time. Maybe it was the exhaustion from weeks of overwork, or maybe it was the way Mom had dismissed my professional obligations without a second thought. For the first time, I found myself wondering what would happen if I had said no. Would Michael have figured out another solution? Would my parents have found a way to help him themselves? Or would the crisis have somehow magically resolved itself, the way problems often do when people are forced to handle them independently? I drove to the location where Michael's car had been towed, a grimy auto shop in South Phoenix that smelled like motor oil and defeat. Michael was pacing outside, phone pressed to his ear, gesticulating wildly as he described his ordeal to someone who was probably more sympathetic than the situation warranted. When he saw me, he hung up and jogged over to my car. Thank God you're here. This place is sketchy as hell, and the mechanic keeps giving me different estimates. First he said $2,500, then $4,000. Now he's talking about maybe needing to replace the whole engine. I followed him inside, where a tired-looking man in greasy coveralls explained the situation with the patience of someone who had delivered bad news about car repairs thousands of times before. The transmission was indeed failing, but it wasn't the catastrophic emergency it had been made out to be. The car was drivable for short distances, and a rebuilt transmission would cost around $1,800, still significant, but not the financial crisis that had pulled me away from my work. Why didn't you get a second opinion before calling Mom? I asked as we walked back to my car. Michael shrugged, seemingly unbothered by the chaos he had created. I don't know anything about cars. That's not my thing. Besides, I figured you'd want to know about it right away, so you could help me figure out what to do. There it was again. The assumption that his problems automatically became my problems, that his lack of preparation was my responsibility to fix. He had never learned to handle adversity because he had never been required to. Every obstacle in his path had been cleared by someone else, usually me, before he had to develop the skills to navigate challenges independently. Michael, I said carefully, I'm 28 years old. I work 60 hours a week. I can't keep dropping everything every time you have a crisis. He looked at me like I had spoken in a foreign language. But you're good at handling this stuff. And you have the money. I don't understand why you're making this complicated. That phrase echoed in my head during the entire drive home. You have the money. Not, thank you for helping, or I appreciate the sacrifice, or even, I'll pay you back when I can. Just the simple, entitled assumption that my financial resources existed for his convenience. I started keeping track after that night, not because I wanted to build a case against my family, but because I needed to see the pattern clearly, to understand whether my growing resentment was justified, or if I was becoming the selfish person Mom increasingly accused me of being. Over the next 6 months, I documented every request, every transfer, every crisis that somehow required my immediate financial intervention. The list grew longer than I had expected. Michael's car repair, Dad's dental work, the home security system that Mom suddenly deemed essential, Michael's community college tuition for classes he would eventually drop, the vacation to San Diego that I funded but wasn't invited to join because it was just for the immediate family. The immediate family. That phrase cut deeper than Mom probably intended. I was part of the family when they needed my money, but not when they made memories or decisions that might actually bring joy rather than stress. The breaking point came during a family barbecue in late September. I had worked a particularly brutal week, staying until nearly midnight every night to meet a client's accelerated deadline. I was exhausted, my back ached from hunching over spreadsheets, and I had been looking forward to a relaxing weekend for the first time in months. But relaxation wasn't in the cards. Mom had volunteered me to bring all the food for the barbecue. Not asked, volunteered. And somehow I found myself spending my Saturday morning at Costco, loading my cart with enough meat, sides, and drinks to feed 15 people. The total came to over $200, money I had planned to spend on the ergonomic office chair my chiropractor had recommended. When I arrived at the house, arms full of grocery bags, no one came out to help. I made 3 trips from my car to the kitchen, carrying everything myself while the family gathered in the backyard, laughing at something Michael was showing them on his phone. "There she is," Dad called out when I finally joined them outside. "Our little provider." Everyone laughed like it was a charming nickname, rather than a reduction of my entire identity to my usefulness. I smiled along, but something cold settled in my chest. When had I become the provider instead of just Lara? When had my value become so tied to what I could give that my personhood had practically disappeared? The final straw came when Michael announced, mid-barbecue, that he had decided to quit his latest job, a data entry position that he had held for exactly 3 months, to pursue his passion for photography. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," Mom gushed. "Following your dreams is so important." Dad nodded approvingly. "Life's too short to be stuck in a job that doesn't inspire you." I waited for someone to ask about the practical considerations. How would he pay his bills? What was his business plan? Had he saved any money for equipment or marketing? But those questions never came. Instead, the conversation immediately shifted to how the family could support his artistic journey. "Lara," Mom said, turning to me with that expectant smile I knew so well, "maybe you could help Michael get started? I saw some photography equipment online that wasn't too expensive." I set down my plate and looked around the table at these people who shared my DNA but who had never once asked about my dreams, my passions, or my plans for the future. They knew I worked in accounting, but none of them had ever asked what I actually did all day, whether I enjoyed my career or what my professional goals might be. They saw me as a solution, not as a person with her own life to live. "No," I said quietly. The word hung in the air like a small explosion. Everyone stopped talking and turned to stare at me. "What do you mean, no?" Mom asked, her voice carrying a warning. "I mean, no, I'm not funding Michael's photography equipment. I'm not covering his expenses while he finds himself. I'm not going to be the backup plan for every impulsive decision he makes." The silence that followed was deafening. The word no had barely finished leaving my lips when the atmosphere around the barbecue table shifted dramatically. It was as if I had detonated a small bomb in the middle of what was supposed to be a pleasant family gathering. The laughter died instantly, replaced by a tension so thick I could practically taste it in the dry Arizona air. Mom was the first to recover from the shock. Her face cycled through several expressions: surprise, confusion, and finally settling on something that looked disturbingly like betrayal. "Lara, I think you misunderstood what I was asking. I wasn't talking about anything expensive, just maybe helping your brother get started with some basic equipment. I understood perfectly, I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. And my answer is still no. Dad set down his beer with more force than necessary, the bottle making a sharp clink against the glass patio table. That's not like you, sweetheart. You've always been generous with family. The word generous hit me like a slap. Generous implied choice, implied that my contributions had been voluntary gifts, rather than expected tributes. But sitting there looking at their shocked faces, I realized that generosity had never been part of the equation. My financial support had become as automatic and unquestioned as the electricity flowing through their walls. Michael, who had been unusually quiet during this exchange, finally spoke up. His voice carried a petulance I recognized from childhood, the same tone he used when he didn't get his way. I don't understand why you're being so weird about this. It's not like I'm asking for a car or something crazy. Photography equipment is an investment in my future. Then invest your own money, I said simply. The silence that followed was different from the shocked quiet that had greeted my initial refusal. This was the heavy, uncomfortable silence of a family system that had suddenly stopped working the way it was supposed to. I could practically see the gears grinding to a halt as they tried to process this new version of me, one who apparently had opinions about how my own money should be spent. Mom tried a different approach, her voice taking on the wounded tone she used when she wanted to induce guilt, without seeming manipulative. I don't know what's gotten into you lately, Lara. You seem so distant, so cold. We're family, we're supposed to help each other. Help goes both ways, I pointed out. When was the last time any of you helped me with anything? The question hung in the air unanswered, because we all knew the truth. Help in our family had always been a one-way street, flowing from me to everyone else, without any expectation of reciprocity. I was the helper, never the helped. The giver, never the receiver. Dad cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken. You've got a good job, your own place. You're doing well for yourself. Michael's still trying to find his way. Michael is 26 years old, I said, feeling years of suppressed frustration finally finding their voice. At what point does finding his way become an excuse for avoiding responsibility? Michael's face flushed red. You think you're better than me because you have some boring office job. I'm trying to do something creative, something meaningful. Sorry if that doesn't fit into your narrow definition of success. I think I'm tired of being treated like an ATM, I replied. I think I'm tired of working overtime to fund other people's dreams while putting my own life on hold. The barbecue ended abruptly after that. Mom made a show of cleaning up while pointedly not looking at me, her movements sharp and angry. Dad retreated to his recliner inside, turning the television volume up louder than necessary. Michael disappeared entirely, probably to his room to complain about me to his online friends who would undoubtedly validate his sense of victimhood. I helped carry plates inside despite the frosty atmosphere, still operating from years of conditioning that told me to smooth things over, to be the bigger person, to apologize for having boundaries. But for once, I didn't apologize. I simply gathered my purse, kissed Mom's rigid cheek goodbye, and left. The phone calls started the next morning. Dad called first, his voice carefully neutral. Your mother's upset, Lara. She feels like you attacked the family yesterday. Maybe you should apologize. For what? I asked. For declining to fund Michael's latest hobby? For being selfish, he said bluntly. For forgetting that family means sacrifice. Your mother and I sacrificed plenty for you kids over the years. The accusation of selfishness stung, but not in the way it would have a year earlier. Instead of immediately doubting myself and scrambling to prove my generosity, I found myself analyzing the claim objectively. Had I been selfish? I had been sending them over $1,000 a month for 2 years. I had sacrificed my social life, my savings goals, and my peace of mind to ensure their comfort. If that was selfishness, then the word had lost all meaning. What sacrifices are Michael making? I asked. Dad went quiet for a moment. That's different. He's still figuring things out. And I figured things out at 18 when I got my first job. Why does he get until 30 to become an adult, while I was expected to be responsible from childhood? The call ended shortly after that, with Dad muttering something about me developing an attitude since moving out. But the calls didn't stop. They never stopped. Mom tried the emotional manipulation route, calling while I was at work to tell me how hurt she was by my sudden change in personality. She reminisced about what a sweet, caring daughter I used to be, as if kindness and financial exploitation were synonymous. She wondered aloud what had happened to make me so hardened and calculating. Michael, predictably, went straight for the guilt. His texts came in rapid succession throughout the week. Nice to know I can't count on my own sister. I guess blood doesn't mean anything to you anymore. Thanks for showing your true colors. Each message was designed to pull me back into the familiar pattern of apologizing, explaining myself, and ultimately giving in to keep the peace. But something had shifted in me during that barbecue confrontation. For the first time, I could see the manipulation clearly, instead of just feeling its effects. The escalation came on Friday evening when I received a group text, something the family had never done before. The message was from Mom's phone, but clearly composed by committee. Family meeting Sunday at 2 p.m. We need to discuss some important issues. Please plan to attend. The formal tone was so unlike our usual communication that I actually laughed out loud. A family meeting. As if we were a corporation, and I was a problematic employee who needed performance management. I didn't respond to the text, which apparently was interpreted as confirmation of my attendance. On Sunday, I received another message. Looking forward to seeing you at 2. Mom's making your favorite cookies. My favorite cookies. The same chocolate chip recipe she had been using to smooth over conflicts since I was 8 years old. The fact that she thought baked goods could resolve what was fundamentally a power struggle showed how little she understood about what was really happening. I made a decision that surprised even me. I wasn't going to attend their family meeting. I wasn't going to sit in that living room and listen to them explain why my money was their right and my boundaries were my character flaws. I wasn't going to be lectured about family loyalty by people who had never once asked what I needed or wanted. Instead, I spent that Sunday afternoon at a bookstore cafe in downtown Phoenix, reading a novel and drinking coffee that I had paid for with money that belonged entirely to me. My phone buzzed repeatedly throughout the afternoon. Missed calls, increasingly frantic texts, voicemails that I didn't bother to listen to. At 4 p.m., I received a message that made everything crystal clear. Your absence today spoke volumes about who you really are. We're disappointed, but not surprised. Some people only care about themselves. I read the text 3 times, feeling something shift inside me, like tectonic plates finding new positions. They had called a meeting to discuss my defiance, then used my absence from that meeting as proof of my selfishness. It was a perfect example of the impossible situation they had created. I was wrong if I participated, and wrong if I didn't, wrong if I gave money, and wrong if I kept it, wrong for having boundaries, and wrong for not having them sooner. That evening, I sat in my apartment and made a list. Not a list of their financial requests this time, but a list of every time they had asked about my life, my goals, my feelings, or my needs over the past year. The page remained blank. I tried to remember the last time Mom had called just to check on me, not because she needed something. The last time Dad had asked about my career aspirations beyond their utility to the family budget. The last time Michael had shown interest in my life, except when it intersected with his problems. The blank page told me everything I needed to know. I wasn't their daughter. I was their resource. And resources don't get to have feelings, boundaries, or lives of their own. For the first time since this conflict began, I felt something that wasn't guilt or confusion or hurt. I felt angry. And that anger, I was beginning to realize, might be the healthiest emotion I had experienced in years. 3 weeks had passed since the family meeting I didn't attend, and the silence from Scottsdale had been deceptive. I knew they were regrouping, strategizing, probably discussing my rebellious phase and how to bring me back into line. The calm felt like the eye of a hurricane, temporary and ominous. I was learning to enjoy the quiet, though. For the first time in years, my weekends belonged to me. I had started taking weekend trips to Flagstaff, exploring hiking trails in the Coconino National Forest, and rediscovering parts of myself that had been buried under years of family obligations. I bought books without calculating whether I could afford them. I went to movies on weeknight evenings without checking my phone every 5 minutes for crisis updates. I was remembering what it felt like to live for myself, instead of merely existing as a solution to other people's problems. The trap, when it finally sprung, was more sophisticated than I had expected. It started with a call from my Aunt Carol, Mom's younger sister who lived in Tucson. Carol and I had always had a cordial but distant relationship. She was the fun aunt who sent birthday cards and holiday gifts, but stayed carefully neutral in family conflicts. Which is why her sudden interest in my life should have immediately raised red flags. "Lara, sweetie, I hope you don't mind me calling out of the blue." Carol's voice was warm and concerned, the perfect tone for what I would later recognize as a carefully orchestrated intervention. "Your mom mentioned you've been going through a difficult time lately." I paused, immediately suspicious. "A difficult time?" "You know, with work stress and everything." "She's worried about you. We all are." "She said you've been withdrawing from the family, not responding to calls or texts. That's not like you." I could hear the manipulation, even through Carol's genuine-sounding concern. Mom had clearly reached out to extended family, framing my new boundaries as a mental health crisis, rather than a reasonable response to years of exploitation. It was a clever move. By positioning me as the one with problems, she avoided having to examine her own behavior or the family's dysfunctional patterns. "I'm actually doing better than I have in years," I told Carol honestly. "I've just been setting some healthier boundaries with my immediate family." "Boundaries," Carol repeated as if the word was foreign. "Honey, I know family can be complicated, but they love you. Your mom is beside herself with worry. She thinks maybe you're overwhelmed with work, or maybe dealing with depression. Have you considered talking to someone?" There it was. The suggestion that my newfound backbone was actually a mental health issue that required professional intervention. It was a masterful piece of gaslighting. If I was seeing a therapist, then clearly something was wrong with me, not with the family dynamic that had treated me like a walking wallet for years. "Carol, I appreciate your concern, but I'm fine. I'm just not willing to be my family's personal bank anymore." The conversation ended awkwardly, with Carol promising to keep me in her prayers and hoping I would work things out with my parents soon. But I knew the real purpose of her call. She was gathering intelligence, assessing my mental state, and reporting back to Mom about whether I was likely to cave under pressure or if more drastic measures would be needed. Those drastic measures arrived the following Tuesday. I was in the middle of reviewing quarterly reports when my assistant knocked on my office door. "Lara? Your mother is here to see you. She says it's urgent." My blood ran cold. Mom had never come to my workplace before. She barely even knew where I worked, having never shown much interest in my professional life beyond its income-generating potential. For her to drive 40 minutes to downtown Phoenix and show up at my office meant she was either genuinely desperate or had decided to escalate the conflict to a new level. I found her in the reception area, dressed in her best casual outfit and wearing the expression of wounded dignity she had perfected over the years. She looked smaller somehow, more fragile than usual, and I recognized it as another calculated move. Make herself appear vulnerable so that anyone witnessing our interaction would see me as the heartless daughter refusing to help her struggling mother. "Mom," I said carefully, aware that my coworkers could hear every word. "What are you doing here?" "I needed to see you," she said, her voice carrying just the right amount of tremor to suggest she was holding back tears. "Since you won't answer my calls or come to family meetings, this was the only way to reach you." I glanced around the reception area, noting how my assistant was pretending not to listen while clearly absorbing every detail of this family drama playing out in our professional space. This was intentional, I realized. Mom had chosen to confront me at work specifically because she knew I would be more likely to give in rather than cause a scene in front of my colleagues. "Can we talk outside?" I suggested. "Of course, honey. I just need 5 minutes of your time." We walked to the parking garage, my heels echoing off the concrete walls. I could feel eyes watching us through the office windows, and I knew this conversation would be dissected in the break room later. Mom had successfully made my family dysfunction into my professional problem. "The house is in foreclosure," she said without preamble once we were out of earshot. The bank sent final notice last week. We have 30 days to catch up on payments, or we lose everything. I studied her face, looking for signs of the emotional distress that should have accompanied such devastating news. Instead, I saw calculation. This felt rehearsed, like a performance she had practiced on the drive over. "How much are you behind?" I asked. $18,000. The number hit me like a physical blow. $18,000. More than half my annual salary, more than I had ever seen in my savings account at one time. It was an impossible amount, a sum that would wipe out everything I had worked for and leave me financially devastated. "How did it get that bad?" I asked. "I was helping with the mortgage payments for almost 2 years. Mom's composure slipped slightly. "Things happened. Michael needed help with his student loans. Your father's medical expenses were higher than expected. The air conditioning unit had to be replaced. It all added up." "So you used the money I sent for the mortgage to pay for other things?" "We used it for family needs," she said defensively. "Everything was a priority. We thought we could catch up later." I felt something inside me crystallize into perfect, cold clarity. They had taken my money, spent it on whatever seemed most convenient at the moment, and then allowed their house to fall into foreclosure, while I believed I was helping them stay afloat. Every sacrifice I had made, every overtime hour I had worked, every personal goal I had postponed, all of it had been for nothing. "I can't give you $18,000, I said simply. "Can't or won't." The mask slipped completely now, revealing the anger that had been simmering beneath her wounded mother act. "Both." Mom stepped closer, her voice dropping to a hiss that wouldn't carry to any potential witnesses. "You're going to let us lose our home? The house you grew up in? The house where we raised you, fed you, clothed you for 18 years? The house where you taught me that my only value was my ability to solve your problems," I replied. "The house where Michael learned that someone else would always clean up his messes. The house where I was never allowed to be anything except useful." "How dare you?" she spat. "After everything we've given you, after all the love and support." "Love?" I interrupted. "When was the last time you called just to ask how I was doing? When was the last time you celebrated something I accomplished without immediately calculating how it could benefit the family? When was the last time you treated me like your daughter instead of your emergency fund?" She opened her mouth to respond, then closed it. For a moment, I saw something flicker across her face that might have been recognition or shame. But it passed quickly, replaced by the cold anger of someone who had been caught in their own manipulation. "You've changed," she said finally. "Living alone has made you selfish and bitter. This isn't the daughter I raised." "You're right," I agreed. "The daughter you raised would have maxed out her credit cards to save you by now. She would have taken out a loan she couldn't afford and worked herself into the ground to fix a problem she didn't create. But I'm not her anymore." Mom stared at me for a long moment, her face cycling through emotions I couldn't read. Finally, she pulled out her phone and made a call while I stood there watching. "Michael?" She said no. "Yes, I tried everything." A pause. "I know. I don't recognize her either." She hung up and looked at me with something that wasn't quite hatred, but wasn't love either. "It was the look you give a stranger who has disappointed you. Someone you thought you knew, but who turned out to be completely different from your expectations. When you lose everything because you were too proud to help your family, don't come crying to us," she said. "We won't be there for you." She walked away without another word, leaving me standing alone in the parking garage, with the echo of her heels clicking against concrete. I waited until I heard her car start and drive away before I allowed myself to breathe. Back in my office, I sat at my desk and stared at my computer screen without seeing it. My hands were shaking, not from fear or guilt, but from the adrenaline of finally standing my ground completely. I had just chosen my own financial security over my family's expectations, and the sky hadn't fallen. For the first time in my adult life, I had said no and meant it. That evening, I called my bank and opened a new savings account. I labeled it Future Home Fund and transferred every dollar I had been planning to give my family. $18,000 they would never see, money that would go toward building my own life instead of subsidizing their dysfunction. The phone rang throughout the night. Mom, Dad, Michael, even Carol calling to check on me after hearing about our difficult conversation. I let them all go to voicemail. For the first time, their emergencies were not my emergencies. Their problems were not my problems. Their choices were not my responsibility. And that realization was both terrifying and liberating in equal measure. The funeral invitation arrived on a Thursday morning, slipped under my apartment door like a secret message. My grandfather, Mom's father, had passed away peacefully in his sleep at 83. The service was scheduled for Saturday at Desert View Memorial Park, the same cemetery where my grandmother had been laid to rest 5 years earlier. I stared at the formal cardstock, feeling a complex mixture of grief and dread. Grandpa Joe had been one of the few family members who had ever seemed to see me as a person rather than a function. He had taught me to play chess, listen to my college plans without calculating their financial benefit to anyone else, and always asked about my life with genuine interest. His loss felt like losing the last witness to who I used to be before I became the family's designated problem solver. But attending his funeral meant facing my parents and Michael for the first time since the parking garage confrontation 6 weeks earlier. It meant walking into a space where I would be expected to play the role of grieving daughter, while they continued their campaign to paint me as the selfish family outcast. I almost didn't go. The thought of spending my Saturday morning somewhere else, anywhere else, felt infinitely more appealing than subjecting myself to their manipulation during what should have been a time for honoring Grandpa Joe's memory. But my love for him was separate from my complicated feelings about the rest of the family, and I refused to let their dysfunction rob me of the chance to say goodbye properly. I arrived at the memorial service 15 minutes early, hoping to pay my respects quietly, and perhaps leave before the reception that would inevitably follow. The desert cemetery was beautiful in the morning light, with saguaro cacti standing sentinel among the headstones, and the distant mountains providing a majestic backdrop for final farewells. I spotted my family immediately. They had claimed an entire row near the front, a united front dressed in appropriate black attire. Mom wore the dress she reserved for special occasions, her hair styled more carefully than usual. Dad had managed to find a tie that didn't clash with his suit. Michael, surprisingly, looked genuinely sad, perhaps the first authentic emotion I had seen from him in months. I chose a seat 3 rows behind them, close enough to participate in the service, but far enough to avoid forced interaction. Several family friends and distant relatives nodded at me politely, and I wondered what version of recent events they had heard. Had I been portrayed as the successful daughter who was too busy to help her struggling family, the ungrateful child who had abandoned them in their time of need, or simply the black sheep who had chosen selfishness over loyalty? The service was beautiful and heartbreaking. Grandpa Joe's longtime friend shared stories about his military service and his 40-year career as a high school science teacher. His pastor spoke about his dedication to family and community. Michael, surprisingly, delivered a brief but touching eulogy about learning to appreciate nature during their fishing trips to Lake Pleasant. I found myself crying, not just for Grandpa Joe's passing, but for the family we might have been if love hadn't gotten tangled up with obligation and manipulation. In another universe, we might have been the kind of family who supported each other's dreams instead of exploiting each other's resources. We might have been people who gathered to celebrate and mourn together, instead of using every interaction as an opportunity for emotional warfare. After the service, I approached the casket to pay my final respects. I placed a single white rose, Grandpa Joe's favorite flower, on the spray of arrangements and whispered a quiet thank you for all the chess games, all the conversations about books and ideas, all the moments when he had made me feel seen and valued just for being me. I was turning to leave when Mom appeared beside me, moving with the predatory grace of someone who had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. "He would have wanted us to be together," she said softly, just loud enough for nearby relatives to hear. Family meant everything to him. I didn't respond, but I didn't walk away either. Something about standing beside Grandpa Joe's casket made running seem inappropriate, even though every instinct told me to escape before this conversation could develop into another manipulation session. "The house situation has gotten worse," Mom continued, her voice carefully modulated to sound defeated rather than demanding. "We got another notice from the bank. 3 weeks left before they start the foreclosure process." I'm sorry to hear that, I said, and I meant it. Despite everything, I didn't want to see them homeless. I just wasn't willing to destroy my own life to prevent it. Your grandfather always said families should stick together through hard times, she pressed on. He helped put us through college, helped us buy our first house. He believed in taking care of the people you love. The emotional manipulation was expertly crafted. Use Grandpa Joe's memory and values to justify their demands. Make me feel like disappointing them was the same as betraying his legacy. Turn my grief into guilt and my boundaries into selfishness. Grandpa Joe also believed people should be responsible for their own choices, I replied quietly. He never asked anyone to bail him out of problems he created himself. Mom's facade cracked slightly. So you're really going to stand there at your grandfather's funeral and refuse to help your own family? I'm going to stand here at my grandfather's funeral and honor his memory by not enabling the kind of irresponsibility he would have been ashamed of. Before she could respond, Dad appeared on my other side, creating a perfect triangle of pressure around me. His approach was different from Mom's emotional manipulation, more direct, more businesslike. Lara, we need to talk seriously about this situation, he said. His voice carrying the authority he had used when I was a child caught breaking rules. You're being unreasonable and it's affecting the whole family. How is me keeping my own money unreasonable? I asked. Because you have more than you need while we're losing our home, he replied. Because family means sacrifice. Because we invested 28 years in raising you, and this is how you repay us. There it was, the transactional view of family love that had been lurking beneath the surface all along. They had invested in me, and now they expected returns on that investment. I wasn't their daughter. I was their retirement plan. Michael joined the circle, completing the trap. His eyes were red from crying, but I could see the familiar anger simmering beneath his grief. Grandpa would be disgusted if he knew how selfish you've become, he said, his voice barely controlled. He always said blood is thicker than water. Then maybe you should act like family instead of creditors, I replied. The words came out sharper than I intended, carrying months of suppressed frustration and years of accumulated resentment. Several relatives turned to look at us, and I realized we had become the kind of family drama that people would whisper about long after the reception ended. Keep your voice down, Mom hissed. People are watching. Let them watch, I said, surprised by my own boldness. Maybe they'll see what really happens when someone in this family tries to have boundaries. Dad's face darkened. You're causing a scene at your grandfather's funeral. Is this really how you want to honor his memory? I'm honoring his memory by refusing to enable the kind of financial irresponsibility that he would have never tolerated, I shot back. Grandpa Joe worked 2 jobs to put himself through college. He saved every penny to buy his first house. He never asked anyone else to pay for his mistakes or fund his dreams. If he were alive today, he'd be ashamed of how you've all been treating me. The silence that followed was absolute and devastating. I had finally said what I had been thinking for months, what I had been too afraid or too conditioned to voice. The truth hung between us, like a wall that couldn't be torn down or painted over. Mom's mask fell away completely, revealing the cold anger that had been building since I first dared to say no. If that's how you really feel about this family, then maybe you don't belong here at all. Maybe I don't, I agreed. Dad stepped forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. If you walk away from us now, if you let us lose our home, because you're too selfish to help, then don't expect us to be here when you need something. I've never needed anything from you except basic respect, I replied, and I've been waiting 28 years for that. Michael's voice cracked with emotion, but I could no longer tell if it was grief for Grandpa Joe or anger at me. You're destroying this family. Everything's falling apart because of you. I looked at each of them, these people who shared my blood, my history, my earliest memories, and felt something inside me finally break free. Not break apart, but break free. Like a bird that had been caged so long, it had forgotten it had wings. No, I said with absolute certainty. I'm not destroying this family. I'm refusing to be destroyed by it. I walked away then, leaving them standing beside Grandpa Joe's casket with their mouths open and their manipulation tactics finally rendered useless. I didn't run, didn't storm off dramatically. I simply walked with dignity toward my car, my back straight, and my conscience clear. Behind me, I heard Mom call out, her voice carrying across the cemetery with crystal clarity. "If you leave now, don't ever come back. You're no daughter of mine." I didn't turn around, I didn't respond. I just kept walking toward my car, toward my future, toward the life I was finally ready to claim as my own. The last thread connecting me to that family had been severed not by my choice, but by theirs. And as I drove away from Desert View Memorial Park, I realized that I felt lighter than I had in years. 6 months have passed since that final confrontation at Grandpa Joe's funeral, and I'm sitting in my new apartment in Old Town Scottsdale, a bright, airy 2-bedroom place with a mountain view that I never could have afforded when I was supporting 3 other adults. The morning light streams through windows that I chose, in a space that I pay for, surrounded by furniture that reflects my taste rather than someone else's needs. The silence in my life is no longer the tense quiet of waiting for the next crisis call. It's the peaceful silence of a Sunday morning that belongs entirely to me, where the only agenda is my own comfort and happiness. My phone still sits on the coffee table, but its notifications come from friends planning weekend hikes, colleagues sharing work achievements, and wellness apps reminding me to drink water, not from family members demanding immediate financial intervention. I blocked their numbers 3 months ago, not out of cruelty but out of necessity. The calls and texts had continued for weeks after the funeral, cycling through every manipulation tactic in their arsenal. Guilt. Grandpa Joe would be heartbroken. False emergencies. Dad's in the hospital. He had a routine checkup. Bribery. We'll pay you back double once things stabilize. And finally, threats. You'll regret this when it's too late. But I had learned to recognize these patterns for what they were. The desperate thrashing of a dysfunctional system that had lost its primary resource. They weren't reaching out because they missed me as a person. They were reaching out because they missed my bank account. The house in Scottsdale went into foreclosure exactly as predicted. I found out through a former neighbor who reached out on social media, expressing sympathy for what she assumed was a shared family tragedy. "I'm so sorry about your parents' house," she wrote. "I know how much that place meant to your family." I felt a pang of sadness reading her message. But it wasn't grief for the house itself. It was mourning for the fantasy one had carried for so long. The belief that if I just gave enough, sacrificed enough, proved my love sufficiently, they would finally treat me like a valued family member, rather than a convenient solution to their problems. According to my neighbor's update, my parents had moved into a rental duplex in Mesa, a significant downsizing that probably felt like a punishment to them but sounded like a reasonable fresh start to me. Michael had moved in with a friend, finally forced into the kind of independent living that most people navigate in their early 20s. I wondered sometimes if they had learned anything from losing the house. Had they recognized the connection between their financial irresponsibility and the consequences that followed? Had they gained any insight into how their treatment of me had driven away the person who had been keeping them afloat? Or had they simply found new ways to blame me for the natural results of their own choices? I suspected the latter, but it no longer mattered. Their growth or lack thereof was no longer my responsibility. My own growth, however, had been remarkable. Without the constant drain of supporting 3 other adults, I had been able to save aggressively toward goals that actually mattered to me. The down payment fund that had been repeatedly raided for family emergencies was now substantial enough that I was actively house hunting. I had enrolled in evening MBA classes to advance my career on my own timeline rather than working overtime to fund other people's mistakes. More importantly, I had rediscovered parts of myself that had been buried under years of hypervigilance and people-pleasing. I took pottery classes on Thursday evenings, joined a hiking group that explored different trails around Arizona every weekend, and started dating again, something I hadn't had time or emotional energy for when every spare moment was consumed by family drama. The dating was particularly revelatory. I had forgotten what it felt like to have conversations about books, travel, career goals, and future dreams, without constantly checking my phone for family emergencies. I had forgotten what it was like to spend money on nice restaurants and weekend trips, without calculating whether those expenses would leave me unable to cover someone else's crisis. My current relationship with David, a software engineer I met through the hiking group, represented everything that healthy relationships could be. He was interested in my thoughts, my goals, my day-to-day experiences. He never made financial demands or treated my success as a resource for his benefit. When I told him about my family situation, something I had been hesitant to share, worried he would judge me for cutting ties with my parents, his response was immediate and unequivocal support. "Good for you," he had said simply. "It takes courage to choose your own well-being over other people's expectations." That validation from someone outside the dysfunction helped me see my choice clearly. I wasn't selfish or cruel or ungrateful. I was healthy. I was finally functioning the way adults are supposed to function, taking responsibility for my own life while allowing others to take responsibility for theirs. The guilt still surfaced occasionally, usually triggered by memories of childhood moments when my parents had genuinely seemed to care about me as more than just a solution to their problems. But I had learned to sit with that guilt without acting on it, to recognize it as the residue of years of conditioning rather than evidence that I was making the wrong choice. I kept a photo of Grandpa Joe on my nightstand, not because I needed permission from his memory to live my own life, but because he represented the kind of person I wanted to become, someone who worked hard, took responsibility for his choices, and treated family relationships as sources of mutual joy rather than opportunities for exploitation. Last month, I received a wedding invitation from my cousin Emma, Carol's daughter. Inside was a handwritten note. "I don't know all the details about what happened with your parents, but I want you to know you're still family to me. I hope you'll come celebrate with us." I cried reading that note, happy tears for the first time in longer than I could remember. It reminded me that family didn't have to be the people who shared my last name and my address for 28 years. Family could be the people who chose to see me, support me, and celebrate with me without expecting anything in return except my presence and participation. I attended Emma's wedding, sat with cousins I hadn't seen in years, and had conversations about life, careers, relationships, and dreams, without anyone once asking me to solve their problems or fund their emergencies. It was a revelation. This was what healthy family dynamics looked like. This was what it meant to be loved for who you were rather than what you could provide. On the drive home from the wedding, I called my therapist, a decision I had made 3 months earlier when I realized I needed professional help processing the complex emotions that came with choosing myself over dysfunction. Dr. Martinez had helped me understand that cutting ties with toxic family members wasn't abandonment, it was self-preservation. She had taught me to distinguish between guilt and grief, between loneliness and freedom, between family loyalty and family exploitation. "How are you feeling after today?" she asked, when I described the wedding experience. "Peaceful," I said, surprised by how true that word felt. For the first time in my adult life, I feel peaceful. That peace wasn't the absence of challenges or the end of all difficulties. I still worked hard, still dealt with stress and setbacks and the normal complications of adult life. But those challenges were mine to navigate, mine to solve or learn from, mine to bear, without the additional weight of 3 other people's choices pressing down on my shoulders. The phone on my coffee table stays silent most evenings now, and that silence has become my favorite sound. No emergency calls, no guilt-inducing texts, no manufactured crises designed to pull me back into a web of dysfunction that had been suffocating me slowly for years. Sometimes I wonder if they think about me, if they've learned to solve their own problems, if they ever recognize the connection between their treatment of me and my absence from their lives. But those thoughts come less frequently now, and they carry curiosity rather than pain. I am 29 years old, financially stable, emotionally healthy, and finally living a life that belongs entirely to me. I wake up each morning without anxiety, spend my money on things that bring me joy, and go to sleep each night knowing that tomorrow will bring opportunities rather than obligations. The little girl who used to believe that love meant sacrifice, that being needed was the same as being valued, that family loyalty required the erosion of self, she's still part of me. But she's no longer in charge of my decisions. I've learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for people is to stop enabling their dysfunction. That sometimes the kindest response to manipulation is to walk away. That sometimes choosing yourself isn't selfish. It's the first healthy choice you've made in years. My name is Lara, and this is the story of how I learned that family should be a source of support, not a system of exploitation. How I discovered that silence can be more powerful than sacrifice, that boundaries are acts of self-love rather than selfishness, and that the person most responsible for my happiness is me. If you're living in the shadow of someone else's needs, if you're exhausting yourself to keep others comfortable, if you've forgotten what it feels like to live for yourself, this is your reminder that you deserve better. You deserve to be seen, valued, and loved for who you are, not what you can provide. You deserve the same freedom I found in that peaceful apartment in Phoenix, where the only person's problems I'm required to solve are my own, and where love is given freely rather than extracted through obligation. You deserve to say no, and mean it, and build a life that belongs entirely to you.